Welcome back to the Mythic Plus guide. No doubt it's been a while, but unfortunately I've been quite busy with other things that took a bit of my time. Quick shameless plug before we start, please drop a sub and don't forget to like this video if it was helpful in any way. But without further ado, let's get into it. Previously we spoke about what Mythic Plus was, how to get into Mythic Plus, and how to push Mythic Plus keys in dungeons. In this video we'll be focusing on what affixes are, class roles, and a few tips on better performance within dungeons. Mythic Plus affixes were introduced not too long ago. This gave WoW a larger progression structure towards the endgame content. An affix is an additional property that affects the way enemies within the dungeon will behave. Since Battle for Azeroth, affixes appear on all Mythic Plus dungeon keys. However, each affix now has an assigned minimum level for it to be eligible to appear. The first affix is gained at level 2, the second at level 4, the third at level 7, and the fourth at level 10. If the keystone has an affix listed on it, then all the enemies in that Mythic Plus dungeon will inherit this property. Active affixes are set on a game-wide week-by-week basis, excluding the seasonal affix. This will remain the same for all players until the next weekly reset. This also means that every keystone will have the same set of levels, 2, 4, and 7 affixes for the week. But let's backtrack a bit and talk about the seasonal affix. The seasonal affix starts at level 10, which would be considered your 4th affix. This is generally to do with the theme of the latest raid tier released. For example, in Battle for Azeroth, we had to deal with the Awakened affix. Obelisks of N'Zoth were present throughout the dungeon, allowing players to enter Ny'alotha and confront powerful servants of N'Zoth within these obelisks. That being said, every affix has a unique concern drawn to it, sometimes changing which dungeons you prefer that specific week. Affixes that include things like bursting, where killing an enemy unit in a dungeon applies debuff to you that inflicts 3.5% of your max health every few seconds. Killing additional enemies while this debuff is active allows it to stack exponentially. There is a wide variety of affixes that can affect your dungeon runs. Sometimes multiple affixes might be greatly unpleasant throughout some weeks, as dungeons with tight corridors could be difficult to maneuver through. Sanguine, an affix which drops pools under dead enemies, healing foes who stand in these pools for 5% of their max HP, or damaging you and surrounding party members for 5% of your maximum HP every second. Now let's dive into class roles within dungeons. While most players want to play the best classes in the game, it isn't always necessary. I would always suggest finding something that you enjoy playing and sticking to it. Whether it's a tank, healer, or DPS, sticking to something will always benefit you in the long run. Once you feel comfortable with that class, feel free to move on to something else. That being said, no class role is more important than the other. So what's your role as a DPS? It's damage. This will always be your priority. Knowing your rotation off by heart is one of the most important things as a damage dealer. Let me oversimplify this by explaining to you that the quicker you kill enemies, the quicker you move through the dungeon, the less mana your healer consumes, and the less damage your tank takes overall. But this way of thinking can lead to a double-edged sword. Some dungeons require damage dealers to interrupt certain enemy spellcasts, which could be detrimental to your group's damage, healing, or tank survivability. Melee DPS generally have shorter interrupt cooldowns. That allows the group to control enemy interactions a lot better. Consider that most groups use 2 melee DPS and 1 range DPS. Moving on to healers. Good healers are indispensable. They keep the group alive, pick up mechanical errors that the group makes, and find the time to DPS in between. But most importantly, don't let anyone die if you can help it. Sometimes the tank might also make a mistake or two, maybe misusing a defensive cooldown, which means that the healer needs to step in and save the tank before he dies, always keeping the healers on their toes. Another important thing to consider is damage. We all know you always have your hands full healing everyone, especially when it's a new group, but try and weave in some damage when the tank is taking things slow. But do take care of your own mana consumption within the dungeon. Sometimes it's better to preserve your mana while waiting for those oh shit moments where the tank almost dies, because they do happen frequently. As the tank, it's your job to pick up any group of enemies before the rest of your party gets hit by them. Use an area of effect skill once you're within range to quickly bring all the mobs to you. You might also want to use a mobility tool to get to the trash before the rest of your party does. Whatever you do, never leave your back turned to a group of enemies for long. You cannot dodge or parry attacks that land from behind. After you grab an enemy trash pack, you will probably want to use a defensive ability to reduce the incoming damage. Abilities that heal or reduce damage are commonly called active mitigation. Each tank has a cheap active mitigation ability that they can use almost immediately after pulling a group of enemies. Each tank class has a unique active mitigation toolkit. Some can reduce damage very well, some can heal really well, most are somewhere in the middle. Learning to manage your resources and use your abilities when they're most needed is key to mastering a tank. One more important thing to consider as a tank are dungeon routes. Knowing where to go in a dungeon and knowing the quickest route in a dungeon can always lead to a much more pleasant experience. The DPS aren't the only ones that contribute to the pace of a dungeon. A tank knowing where to go is always convenient. So let's head into tips and tricks. Once you start doing hierarchies, you'll end up realizing that the trash packs within these dungeons hit a lot harder. This carries over to avoidable damage, trying to avoid as much damage as possible by using your own defensive cooldowns when you're in a tight situation, or when you know you won't be able to avoid the next incoming damage is important. Always try and position your character in a safe spot while killing trash or bosses. If a trash pack has a knockback effect, try and position yourself close to a wall so that you don't get thrown into a trash pack that you weren't supposed to pull. Moving on to consumables, this includes your food buff, flasks, prepots, gems, scrolls and enchants are all quite important. Most of these items are affordable on the auction house or you can craft them yourself. Your food buff along with your war scrolls don't carry over if you die. So, if you frequently die in the dungeon, that might not be such a great idea unless you're the Bill Gates of WoW. Things such as your flasks, gems and enchants all stay on your character and proceed through death, so try and buy those. One thing we mainly forget to change is our talents and gear before activating a Mythic Keystone. You can't change any talents or gear while a Mythic Keystone is active. And this will conclude our Mythic Plus Intermediate Guide. I appreciate it if you've made it this far. I would like to start the Mythic Plus Expert Guide when Shadowlands releases, as there are some Mythic Plus changes coming. The Expert Guide will mainly focus on third-party sites such as Raider.io, delving deep into class theory and pushing for the best result possible. Please like this video and share it with a few friends and subscribe for future guides. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comment section below. Thank you very much. Cheers.